Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Caspian Policy Center, and good afternoon, good evening, those who are joining us from the Caspian region and also from Kazakhstan as well. I'm Efkan Nifty, the CEO of the Caspian Policy Center. We have a very important event today on the protests and unrest in Kazakhstan, what happened and what's next. We are very privileged to host distinguished speakers today. And it's good to have Ambassador of Kazakhstan to the United States, His Excellency Yerzhan Ashikayev, at this panel as well. Today, we'll put a spotlight on the recent developments in Kazakhstan and what it means for the country and the region going forward, and also U.S. relations with Kazakhstan as well. In brief summary, Kazakhstan, long as seen and as an example of stability in Central Asia, experienced some difficulties in recent weeks, and we'll be discussing this during this panel. There has been multiple narratives in the wake of the protests and also following the incidents happened in Almaty. Moderating today's event is Ambassador Richard Hoagland, who is our board member and also former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan. It's good to have him as a expert on this panel and also moderation by him. At this time, I want to stop my remarks because I know we have a very limited time and very experienced speakers today. Again, thanks for joining. We have seen a lot of interest in this event, particularly over 100 registrations, and I think it's a very timely to have this discussion. With this, I want to hand the floor to Ambassador Hoagland to introduce our speakers and also do the moderation of the discussion. Thank you. Welcome again.
And thanks very much to you, Efkan. Good day, good evening. First and foremost, before we do anything else, I would like to offer personal condolences to those families who have lost members in Kazakhstan to this horrible tragedy, and also our heartfelt wishes to others who are suffering, who have had their lives disrupted. We know that Kazakhstan is a strong country. The people are a strong people, and there will be recovery and things will go on. But this kind of disruption is very, very painful. And again, we offer our very, very best wishes to everyone. What we're going to do for the first part of this webinar is listen to our speakers who have prepared remarks. And we are going to go in this order. First, it will be Ambassador Ashikayev, and then we'll go through. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. After all of the speakers are finished, we'll then turn to a moderated discussion. So without further ado, let me say, Ambassador Ashikayev, we are enormously grateful that you are participating today. We know that you have been deeply, deeply concerned about everything in your home country. We look forward to your explanation and your government's explanation of what has happened and what is happening right now. So over to you, Ambassador. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Hoagland. And first and foremost, I would like to thank Caspian Policy Center, Mr. Efkan Nifty, for the attention to this situation, which clearly has been one of the most tragic incidents in the history of my young nation. So a lot of information is circulating, a lot of speculations are around these events, but let me shed light on the current stance and share with some thoughts how things developed on the ground. Now, currently, the situation is under full control of the government. The situation is overall stable and secure. Just yesterday, the state of emergency was lifted across the country. As you know, the CSTO peacekeepers are also been leaving, and it was announced today that the last peacekeeper, according to the timetable set by President Tokayev of phased withdrawal of CSTO peacekeepers, has left the country. So there are no CSTO peacekeepers currently in Kazakhstan. So we all agree, I've been part of different discussions, we all agree that what started as peaceful protests over the quite legitimate concerns and grievances of the public, that agenda was hijacked and stolen by some criminals, perpetrators of different kind, including, and this is important point by the government, including by some terrorist groups, triggering riots and attacks against not only civil administrative buildings, but also against law enforcement and military facilities. We clearly saw that some of the attackers had clearly had an experience of previous military experience, which was used, and this appeared to be the demonstration of the activity of so-called sleeping cells. Now, a special investigation task force has been instructed to bring to justice all the militants, all the accomplices involved in crimes against civilians. It's important to know that the government has no intention to punish peaceful protesters whatsoever. Of course, situation on the ground may vary. The situation could be and is very emotional, but it was a firm stance of the government, of the president himself, as he instructed the Prosecutor General's office to soften the penalties in case where there are no aggravating circumstances, and the government will definitely, and authorities will definitely ensure due process, respect for human rights and transparency, and the rule of law. According to the data, those are official statistics. We've clearly seen that over 10,000 are detained and they're brutally and beaten without any access to legal protection. So let us operate with official statistics. And let me, before that, point out that penitentiary population of Kazakhstan now stands at lower than 30,000. So the very figure of 10,000 means 1/3 of that population added up on top of the existing. So it could be physically impossible to have that many people in detention centers. So courts considered 8,354 administrative cases. Over 3,300 individuals were warned without any penalties imposed, such as fines or arrests or detentions. Courts imposed fines for 1,600 individuals, and currently under arrest there are 102 individuals. We can clearly share the link in the chat to that statistics for everyone to be able to operate with facts on the ground. So every challenge is an opportunity. It's a stress test, the biggest stress test for the Kazakhstan, for the independent Kazakhstan. And the government and the nation has demonstrated their resilience, that they are resilient enough to withstand the pressure and bounce back. We have enough resources and political will to overcome this crisis. We turned a new page in Kazakhstan's history, and the president has never stepped back. President Tokayev has never stepped back from his determination, from his political agenda of further political, economic, and institutional modernization of our country. So we are speaking about social economic modernization and political liberalization. This is something that he is very much keen to pursue further. So there are new tasks announced before the new government. The major emphasis is placed on wealth redistribution to address the grievances, legitimate grievances and concerns of the general population. We have to also understand that the entire process, reform process, is or will be designed to make sure that any economic progress statistically should be translated in practical gains for ordinary population. So there are a number of practical tasks set forward by the president. The government is about to publish its economic outlook and economic program. So we'll see what are the practical measures there. Regarding the lessons learned and the position of the United States, I would like to underline that the US government has been closely monitoring the situation, and the very notion of the support to constitutional institutions has been important political message, alongside with, of course, the messages to respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and also for a peaceful solution of the conflict. What, in terms of the lessons, I would say no one would have predicted this to happen in Kazakhstan. No one. It could well be said that the government was underperforming in terms of addressing the grievances, but no one could have predicted, or in the worst of their dreams, that the situation will go the most negative way. So that means for any country, not only in our geography, but globally, overlooking the issues of grievances, of public grievances, is quite risky, given the fact that we are living in the pandemic. We've seen that the trigger of the situation actually was the hike in prices for LPG, which is again connection to global markets, and what we've seen the rises in gas prices in Europe and elsewhere. So we're all living in an interconnected, globalized world. Whatever is relevant for Kazakhstan is definitely relevant for all other countries. I, of course, look forward to our discussions, and let me stop here to give enough time to other panelists as well. Thank you.
And thank you to you, Ambassador. Before we move on, let me re-emphasize something that the ambassador said, and that is that there were actually two separate simultaneous events. There were the peaceful economic demonstrations, but then simultaneously something much deeper and much more serious erupted. The reason I'm emphasizing this is that too many of the international reports, and especially Western journalists, are linking the two and saying it was one event. We need to make sure that we understand that peaceful protesters have their rights in Kazakhstan. Violent extremists do not. And thank you for emphasizing that, Ambassador. We're now going to move on to our next speaker, and this is Mr. Almaz Chukin, who is the managing partner of Visor Kazakhstan. Sir, we're very honored to have you coming to us from Kazakhstan, and we very much look forward to your comments. So the floor is yours, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hovland. And greetings to all participants and Ambassador Shikbayev. I would try to be brief, but starting with the question, what happened? So in general, you all know what happened, but the key events were like 2nd of Jan and 5th of Jan. And when the events unfolded, I think Takayev made a very smart move, because first 3 days, he showed very much restraint, and we can all see in the videos actually that police was basically unarmed. They had a very, except batons probably, they didn't have any shield, they had nothing. Unfortunately, later they showed also they didn't have much at all to bring later, but that was 3 days while the the government was trying to pacify the protesters. But then all of a sudden we got violent events, and I think I was part even of the people's militia here. I live in a compound with about 100 houses, so we created our own like a detachment, and we're monitoring the situation in the evenings. And it was quite nervous for 2-3 days. The city was basically, the police was fighting somewhere, and the whole city was left to its own. And there was 3 different groups, of course: peaceful protesters, daytime protesters, I would call them. Then you had the looters, and some of the very peaceful people also turned into looters, unfortunately, during the night when the stores were broken in and everybody tried to grab whatever they can. But what is surprising, and that there were different people, because normal looters, they do not attack for 5 hours police station. Normal looters do not try to take over the TV tower of the city, because there is nothing valuable there except the signal. So, and these people were moving around in cars. All of a sudden, the city was flooded with cars with no license plate. They took away license plates. And in conditions when the mobile communications sometimes were shut down, they had walkie-talkies, basically. They were coordinating things among themselves quite well, which is quite showing that there was something behind it. I don't want to speculate who and how they did this. Enough that we have a head of the national security in prison for treason already, but we'll see. There were different plots, of course, and Russians came up first. That's a US plot. No, I mean, not the Russian government, but the Russian commentators, saying they disrupted Ukraine. Now they want to take southern border of Russia and blah, blah, blah. And all other speculation, all the way down to CIA, but probably you know better than I do what CIA can do. The second question I want to mention is why have police, army, National Guard failed? I think this event showed that it was totally, utterly unprepared. And there was one of the jokes which happened that the president mentioned in his speech that police and army did not coordinate well. Of course, they did not coordinate well. They never tried to coordinate, and probably the usual competition between, like in U.S. Army Navy, you can multiply that, and the relationship between the army and police is not very nice. Let's put it mildly, and especially with the coordination. Plus, so now the president is putting the test that we need special forces to deal with this kind of situation, because army is not good dealing with the civil disobedience. Army is basically army. It's not for to put them in the street. So, and the last event which I want to mention, because I think yesterday was the last day when our loan transition ended, and so the statement which President Nazarbayev made yesterday put an end to this. So now we have finally not 2 leaders of the state, but 1. There are a lot of questions about snacks, and I wouldn't comment on this, but what's on the plate is oligarchs, the 60% of economy in foreign ownership. It's not bad, but I mean, dealing with this is not easy. The reforms, you cannot do shock therapy, you have inflation deteriorating. In the last 5-6 years, the real income of people is going down. You have very nice population growth, but it is a problem because 400,000 people turn 18 every year, and you need roughly 500,000 new jobs every year. Political establishment issues, what team will come in? And the last question will be, who is Mr. Takayev? And in this regard, I would just want to end with a very optimistic note. I think he has 40 years of diplomatic experience. He's a very experienced person, and he is not Saakashvili. So he is a very conservative reformer. And from his first steps, we see that economy first, and he started doing a lot of steps in direction of fixing economy. But political reforms, he said, wait till fall. I will announce what I will do in the fall. So I would sum up with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, sir. That added important information to our discussion to go. We are going to continue further now with our next speaker. Akboda Karabayeva is a citizen of Kazakhstan. She's also one of our Caspian Policy Center long-term valued colleagues. She is also a PhD candidate at George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. Akboda, we very much look forward to your personal point of view and additional information that you can add for us. So please, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think the previous speakers gave a pretty good rundown of events, so I'd like to comment on a couple of misconceptions that I noticed in the Western information space, because I'm a consumer of both news here and on the ground. So first, I think there's a tendency to believe that the protests were all about the gas prices. And I think as Ambassador Shukbayev very well explained that definitely the spike in prices got people out on the streets, but was largely just a trigger. Instead, grievances over growing inequality, corruption and nepotism, and uneven development in the regions, and a whole bunch of other socioeconomic issues have been building up for years before. And then the next one is that some people say that protests were a smokescreen for an attempted coup. We have not received any follow-up information or evidence from the government regarding the attempted coup or the unidentified armed groups, whether like with the connections to the criminal or terrorist networks. There hasn't been any concrete evidence revealed to the public yet. But we do, however, know for sure that peaceful protests erupted over longstanding frustrations with the old regime. And I'd like to also note how remarkably peaceful, civil, and well-organized the peaceful protests were in the first 2 days. And as side note, also that different cities had different experiences, with Almaty seeing most of the violence and destruction. And of course, different layers of the population were affected in very different ways as well. So now the humanitarian situation that we often, what I want to comment on a couple of things here too, that we tend to neglect to recognize the complex, diverse, and far-reaching impacts on the ordinary Kazakhstani people. So officially, we have, as of today, we know that President Tokayev estimated the economic damage from the unrest at $2 to $3 billion, with multiple state buildings destroyed, businesses, shopping malls, and banks looted, and police cars burned down. We also know that 225 people died, 19 members of the security forces, and 206 civilians. And although despite continuous demands of the civil activists, we still do not have an official list of names of people who died or are declared as officially missing. And it's been 2 weeks since the night of the deadly clashes. And I think the frustration is growing in the civil society over that. But human impacts do not stop here. Many families of victims lost their breadwinners and are now struggling to pay rent and utilities. The closure of destroyed businesses and banks left many without income as their workplaces are no longer operating. Arson of businesses within residential buildings in Almaty forced some families into internal displacement. Looting of grocery stores left some neighborhood in Almaty without access to basic necessities for the first at least couple of days, when it was still dangerous to drive to other parts of the city. Then a large influx of injured people has overloaded hospitals, and this is against the background of a current 20-fold spike in the COVID incidence rate. And we also now hear stories reported by the independent media outlets, which I'm happy to share a link to, stories of wrongly detained individuals reporting brutal detentions on suspicion of participation in the riots, with prolonged interrogation, beating, and pressure to confess, and peaceful protesters, some of them face charges as well. So all are in need of legal support. And then there's also, of course, a deep collective psychological trauma. Would that be people directly affected by violence and destruction, or those who stayed at home and were staying at home disoriented with no understanding of what was happening and unable to connect with their loved ones, to contact them because of the full internet and mobile blackout. So with this all going on, people also have mobilized to help society recover. Volunteer networks and local NGOs organized to clean the streets of Almaty, search for missing persons, distribute first aid kits, medicine, groceries, and basic supplies to the affected communities, and much, much more. Overall, I think it will take a lot of time and courage and material resources for Kazakhstan to recover from the January events that many now call Khanda Kantar, which is translated as the Bloody January. But it's definitely inspiring to see how people united to respond to this crisis on a spontaneous, self-organized, and grassroots level. So moving forward, I'd say there is hope in the air vis-a-vis the promised reforms, but and that people believe that the government, people want to believe that the government will deliver on the promises, but there's also a lot of skepticism, and understandably so, after years of little change. So unless they see real action on those promised reforms, trust in government will not be restored. So yeah, I think on that I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer the questions and follow up on these points later on. Thank you.
And thanks so much to you, Ms. Karabayeva. I especially appreciate that you emphasize people pulling together, citizens of Kazakhstan, working together. This is very good news in a difficult situation, and it is certainly to be expected because we know the people of Kazakhstan and they will recover. We will now turn to our final initial speaker. We are very honored to have Dr. Gavin Helf, who is a senior expert from the U.S. Institute of Peace and a longtime follower of events in Kazakhstan. So, Dr. Helf, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't want to be too repetitive of what everybody else has done, but I do want to talk about things that were surprising and not surprising in this. And we all know, those of us who follow Central Asia over many decades, that events like this usually start with something very simple. A rise in liquid petroleum gas, the price of tomatoes in the market, a conflict over a water inlet on a border. So it's not surprising, and there's certainly a history of economic grievance in Western Kazakhstan that shouldn't have been surprising at all. What's really surprising is how the geography of these protests spread, which suggests that there's a great deal of pent-up frustration. And all of us anywhere in the world understand what the frustration of 2 years of COVID, of disappointment in the impact that that's had on the economy, frustrations around corruption, frustrations around reform not happening enough. There are plenty of reasons for grievance to express itself. I do want to say one of the things that did surprise me was, the government of Kazakhstan has been very good at managing discontent. Sometimes that's by making concessions. So if raising the price of liquid petroleum gas causes a problem, then you can lower the price. of liquid petroleum gas. You can, make other economic concessions. You can use very targeted and limited means of suppression. You can do things like the old typical blame the prime minister and blame the government, who came up with this crazy idea in the first place. So there's kind of a whole game plan about how you deal with situations like this that didn't seem to work this time. And one of the things that we saw, and it's still very murky, and there's still a big fog of war about who was doing what and how it developed, but things turned very quickly against the first president, Nazarbayev. Things happened like statues started to come down. We saw a very focused sort of move from liquid petroleum gas to economic corruption. The police reacted in ways in different parts of the country that were surprisingly strong. And led to people who were peaceful protesters falling under a security response that I don't think that they expected. And then on 2 weeks ago, on the 5th, we saw a crazy escalation in the sort of, what Mr. Chukins called the nighttime protests, the sudden, organized, focused, organized violence that was directed against the security forces, directed against administrative buildings, not necessarily aimed at seeking a redress for grievance. There have been a lot of explanations for this. There have been explanations that point to organized crime elements that were favoring one side against another in an elite struggle. There's been talk about outside Islamists, although one thing I can say that I haven't heard, and USIP, we work with returnees from Iraq and Syria, and I have not heard from anybody involved in the Jusan operations in Kazakhstan that somehow, the returnees from Iraq and Syria have been involved in any of this. So that hasn't come to me. We've heard, the self-proclaimed leadership of opposition forces outside the country, like Mr. Ablyazov and in DVK, who continue to sort of try to take advantage of this. One thing that I actually saw some protest starting to focus on the Russians coming in under the CSTO. So I think the point of this is that grievance in Kazakhstan is going to be exploited by somebody. Legitimate economic protest is something that other political entrepreneurs, ideological entrepreneurs are going to try to take advantage of. And we saw some of that. One of the things that I think is very hard to ignore is the fact that this appears to have also been a breakdown in the planned transition from the first president, Nazarbayev, to his successor, President Takayev. It's clear from what we're seeing happening to close association family members of President Nazarbayev. It's clear in what we're seeing is really a purge of in the security forces and the government of those close to Nazarbayev. And today, I guess, we saw the official change in the constitutional law that puts Nazarbayev in charge of the National Security Council being, transferred over to Takayev officially. So there was a breakdown in that transition and the plan that went. I think that's also super important everywhere in Central Asia to pay attention to the fact that transitions from one leader to another leader are very difficult times when entrepreneurs of all stripes can try to take advantage of a breakdown in that process. And just to quickly, answer a little bit the second question, where do we go from here? I think there are 2 points that are worth considering, and the event horizon is still quite open on. One is where will Tokayev go with this? As we like to say, sort of in American policy situations like this, okay, well, now Tokayev owns it. This is Tokayev's problem. It's not Nazarbayev's problem anymore. He can't say, you know, the old guy is on my shoulders and I can't do anything. He has to come up with his definition of what he wants to be. I'm very happy to hear from Ambassador Ashikbayev, who emphasized the point that Tokayev started out as a reformer and he has never, you know, moved from that position, and that he intends to do that going forward. A Tokayev that relies on security forces, CSTO, and suppression in the streets is a Tokayev that's going to look like Lukashenko. And I think a vision of Tokayev that looks as a reformer and one who tries to engage the grievance that exists in the country, who tries to take advantage of the partner that civil society can be. And Akbota talked about the role of civil society. I think probably I could say through COVID and through the difficulty of the last 2 years, even Islamic civil society, civil society is a partner to the extent that it's met halfway. So I see sort of a very optimistic scenario, and I see a less optimistic scenario. The last thing that I'll mention is some of you will recall that before COVID and in the US National Security Council strategy on Central Asia, the first point is to encourage Central Asia, the 5 countries of Central Asia, to act as a unit. 79 million people who are able to take control of their own destiny. This is largely based on changes in leadership, both in Uzbekistan and now Kazakhstan. The future of the region as a unit of 79 million people who are able to deal with their own problems themselves, like the extent to which Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan played a positive role in the problems last April between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. A region that's able to hold together. I wonder what the sort of use of the CSTO and an increased role for Russia in the region means for that regional cooperation. A region that is united and acting as a common market and as a political bloc, a diplomatic bloc, is much stronger than one that is reliant on and allowing outside forces to play a role. So those are the two sort of looking forward questions that I have that I think are going to be critical to how the region develops over the next decade.
Thank you very much, Dr. Helf. You've raised more than 2 questions. You've touched on a great deal of questions that many of us have. We are now going to move into a question and answer session. And as the moderator, I'm going to pose the first question to Ambassador Ashikbayev. And let me say, sir, as a former ambassador myself, I know that there are limits on what you can say in public. But there is one thing that I would like you to comment on, if at all possible. On January 10th, President Tokayev made a telephone call to the European Council President Charles Michel. And reportedly, during that conversation, President Tokayev said that there were militants from terrorist groups from Central Asia, Afghanistan, and the Middle East. Now, this would sort of imply what Dr. Helf had raised there, which is that there might have been returnees from Syria. There might have been ISIS cells waiting for the moment when they could strike. Can you comment any further on what your president meant by saying that there were militants from Central Asia, Afghanistan, and the Middle East participating? I know it's a hard question, but what you can say, we would appreciate.
Well, thank you for this question. And I saw there are some questions in the chat also addressed specifically on this topic. As I mentioned, well, any link to any country or the region does not mean that those are government supported militants. Well, we do have already some facts on the ground of the involvement of some extremist groups. For example, the extremist wing of Tablighi Jamaat was discovered in Taldykurgan region, and this information can be found on the KNB website. What's the name? Yakın İnkar. I heard that name for the first time, but clearly they've been operational in Kyrgyzstan for some time. We also saw some links, and Mr. Chukin clearly indicated that no peaceful protesters or no looters will be interested in attacking media outlets or the TV stations or law enforcement agencies. So, and what is also evident is that we, up until January the 5th, protests were mostly peaceful, and police and law enforcement acted with utmost restraint. And that also quite visible from the statistic that the majority of injured during those first several days were from law enforcement. They've actually been, as I say, shielding the government institutions with their own bodies. And you can clearly see what kind of task they had to perform those days. And it should also be noted that 19 police officers were killed during those days. And on top of that, we've seen coordinated action. Late evening of January the 5th or early in the morning of January the 6th, situation deteriorated not only in Almaty, but simultaneously in several regional centers. And that was orchestrated action. So there are so many facts on the ground, but as I said, my president also instructed to carry out the investigation, and we will not be shy to sharing it with the colleagues. I have seen from the list of participants, attendees of this webinar, that there are many, both your colleagues, Ambassador Kroll, former and current employees of the State Department, of different agencies, and we have already agreed that any information on terrorist activities will be shared with our partners. We don't have the reason to hide that information.
Thank you so very much for that extended remark and your honest answers to the questions, what you can answer and what can't be answered yet. We do indeed have questions coming in from our watchers, and in fact, one from Ambassador George Kroll, former ambassador to Kazakhstan. And he raises the issue of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO. And to boil down his question, is basically, what are the implications for the region in the future for the use of the CSTO? And what's behind that question is that the CSTO has never been used before in its nearly 30 years of existence. Besides that, CSTO in the past has said it cannot be used for internal disturbances. This was an internal disturbance, at least it appears on the surface. So with the CSTO coming in, that changes the dynamic in the region. We know from recent negotiations between the United States and Russia that President Putin apparently wants to close the Iron Curtain once again. Everything on his side of the Iron Curtain is his, and the West should not be involved in any way at all. For anyone who would like to answer, can you please comment on the implications of the CSTO being involved in this situation?
I can give just the point of view from here. I understand
Yes.
the implications, and I think there are experts who know this better, how it will play out in the future. But for us here in Almaty, that was a very important psychological signal. I think on the 6th or 7th, when it all started, it was just the news that the help is coming. It didn't matter much from where, but the citizens of the city saw that we have inadequate forces, the police stretched too thin, there is nobody else to help them. So I think in this regard, that was a smart move on President Takayev's policy at the moment. But again, I will leave in the international consequences aside. And I will touch briefly upon the Iron Curtain. I think this is a major concern for all of us, and we watch with much of nervousness what's going on with Russia in the West, because we are always trying to stay, and here we are becoming a little bit in a dangerous territory. You just imagine after this conflict, somebody will attack Russia, automatically we are obliged to fight for Russia also. So this is not a scenario we wish for. But even without the war, the sanctions and all other things, they're making life very complicated because economies are very much interlinked. And you remember this famous story about the Siemens turbines going through Kazakhstan somewhere in Russia. So in general, we are not fans of this conflict, which is going on outside of our control. Thanks.
Mr. Chukin, thank you so much for that. I wonder if there's anyone else who would like to comment on this. Dr. Health?
So the conventional wisdom, I think, or the most sort of logical assumption that's made among the pundits that follow Central Asia in this country is that this was a demonstration of President Putin's support for Tokayev. If you follow the idea that some of this violence was being done by people associated with former President Nazarbayev, this was a call to them that no, Russia has sided with Tokayev in this transition, and that that Russia will stand in the future with Tokayev. A couple things that are interesting about the intervention, however, is Ambassador Hoagland mentioned, it's the first time Russia has acquiesced to become involved. They were asked in by Kyrgyzstan back in April when they were in a conflict with Tajikistan, and several other times, like in 2010 during the Osh events, they were requested to come in, and they've always said they would not, get involved in domestic things. That explains, I think, the sudden claim, simultaneous claim that at least some of the violence was being caused by well-trained terrorists from the outside, when in fact, it was probably more plausible to think that it was parts of the regime that were committing treason, and the head of the KMB was arrested for treason, against other parts of the regime that were loyal to Tokayev. So putting their finger on that scale. Some of the interesting things, though, is that they kind of reluctantly brought Armenia and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and some others in, which has led a lot of people, I think, who, especially in Central Asia, to worry that this is the reassertion of some kind of a Brezhnev doctrine, which was the doctrine that Moscow reserves the right to save regimes that are affiliated with it ideologically, using military force if it feels like. I think that's a big stretch. I think that Russia is very focused right now on what's happening on its western border. It's probably concerned about a situation like happened in Belarus and doesn't want to see that. But it's very much focused strategically, I think, on what's going on in Ukraine and along the Ukrainian border. And I've seen it my interpretation is Russia's been somewhat reluctantly drawn in to act as a stabilizing force in Central Asia over the last year, over a series of rather disruptive events like the overthrow of the president in Kyrgyzstan, the conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, obviously the removal of American troops and the return of the Taliban. These are all things that have been sort of drawing Russia in to paying more attention to the situation in Central Asia, but I would say probably somewhat reluctantly given all the other things on their plate.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Health. And let me say to our audience, I'm very grateful for the questions coming in. I'm following them. I'm trying to conflate a few of the questions because our time is getting very short here. I think there was one important question that was raised quite early in this session, and that is, would it be useful and helpful for Kazakhstan and for the image of Kazakhstan to invite in outside observers for the process after the events now? And specifically, would it be useful to have OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, observers come in, not to tell people what to do, but to add legitimacy to the next steps the government's taking? I would turn to our Kazakhstani guest for the first answers to this. Any of the three of you, do you have anything you'd like to say about this? Yes, Ambassador Ashapayev, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Ambassador, thank you so much. There is a clear understanding on the part of both President Tokayev and the government that their actions now and in the upcoming weeks and months will determine whether we as a country, as a nation, are able to address the root causes and succeed in winning the public support and broader legitimacy for the actions taken during these January days. The role of civil society here should be stressed. Instead of bringing the OSCE or any other international organizations, let me remind the participants that Kazakhstan is among those 110 plus countries that issued standing invitation to UN special mandate holders. And we've clearly seen them coming on different topics, be it issues of peaceful gatherings or the human rights in the times of counterterrorism, etc., etc. But the emphasis should be placed on domestic. We cannot be a nation that should be relying upon some foreign endorsement. This is not the way governments succeed. So we are open for any type of interaction, but if this is Kazakhstan and the rule of law, the constitution, the legislation are all Kazakhstanis, and it's up to Kazakhstan and its citizens and its government institutions to deal with that. And let me also address some of the previous issues, because what I've seen is kind of conventional wisdom ruling the comprehension of or shaping the comprehension of those events. But those are stereotypes. Those are stigmas that is so often brought for judgment. But stereotypes are not the best way to address the current situation in Kazakhstan, because it's multi-layer. It's we have so many interests of different actors, mainly within the country, domestically. And we've seen that from the picture. The events that started in Western region, they remain peaceful. but they turned violent in some others who actually were protesting in solidarity. So there are no easy answers. There are no simple answers to those questions, but I want all the participants, while making their judgments, to double check, to fact check, and not to use those conventional wisdoms.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador. Let me just remind our audience that Kazakhstan has always had a very positive relationship with the OSCE. And in fact, it's the only Central Asian country that has ever held the rotating chairmanship of the OSCE. That was in 2010. Akbura, I saw you had your hand up. A very brief comment, please, because I'd like to go to one final question and our time is running out. But the floor is yours briefly, ma'am.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to comment on the OSCE involvement. I think actually that it doesn't have to be like an infringement on any sovereignty on part of Kazakhstan. And a lot of people would welcome such a signal of commitment to democratic reforms, especially in the civil society in Kazakhstan. And OSCE can provide a lot of expertise as they relate to electoral reforms. So, and I think in a sense that could also balance the discourse around like Russian involvement in this situation, especially given that there are some frustrations building up over the discourse around the Kazakhstan, the January unrest in Kazakhstan in Russia, as some ethno-nationalist moods are emerging there that are somewhat that many people, let's say, are unhappy with.
Thank you very much for that additional thought. I appreciate the two sides. I have one final question that's drawn from our audience, and I'm going to ask you to keep your answers very short. What's the best answer you can give quickly, and then we'll move on. And the question is this: what should the United States government be doing now in Kazakhstan, and especially for Kazakhstan? How can the US government be helpful moving forward? Please, who would like to take the first stab at this with a brief answer?
I can give a very brief answer. I think some of the signals during these events were not well calculated, but of course it was difficult, but I think they were not very successful. For the future, my advice will be just US is doing in general everything correct. You know, I mean, long term, 30 years, being a stable friend and understanding and developing together the economy of Kazakhstan. I think what I would recommend just to show restraint, not hurry with any conclusions and not point fingers at anything, because we don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. And I think the US State Department even knows less than we do.
That was a very wise answer. Thank you so much for that. And I hope it was heard in the halls of power in Washington. Other comments yet?
I would say, I hope that we can give the reformer Takayev the benefit of the doubt in the way that we gave Mr. Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan the benefit of the doubt when he announced that he was going to reform, and there were a lot of skeptics. I think we need to be able to encourage this working out the right way, rather than seeing, I think, a securitized version of a response.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dr. Health. Anyone else? Yes, Ambassador, I saw you come on now.
Yeah, my take would be there are two actually recommendations, and what I'm working on as an ambassador here is great engagement, first and foremost. Let me remind you that while billions of investments, of US investments, are still present in Kazakhstan and they are not disappearing anytime soon, we really need to have a much more active involvement of the US administration. For the past year, we've seen only one high-level visitor from Washington, D.C. This is the first one. The second one, give Kazakhstan, recognize its own value. Don't look at Kazakhstan or at the region through some other lenses. Afghan, Ukraine, global competition between the superpowers. We deserve the very focused attention on our own merits. And it will be mutually rewarding, both for the US and for Kazakhstan and for entire region, as it has been the case for the past 30 years. Thank you.
And thanks to you, Ambassador. I'm smiling because you make me wish I were calling the shots today, but I'm not. Listen, we could go for another hour, I'm certain, but we've already gone past our allotted time. So I'm going to turn the floor back over to our Director, Chief Executive Officer of the Caspian Policy Center, Mr. Evgan Nifty. The floor is yours to close this out, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. Terrific panel. All our colleagues who attended this panel, spoke at this panel, thanks for your contribution. Ambassador Ashkabayev, Almas Chukin, Akbora Karibayeva, Gavin Health. Good to have you on this important and timely event, and all our attendees who attended patiently, and huge interest from the audience. And I saw there were a lot of questions coming through. I wish we could respond all of them, but we have time limit on this. And I want to say that crises are not always bad. It also gives opportunity to recover and see what are the issues in any given country. And this also presents opportunity, perhaps, to have a new contract with the society and also new vision with the society and develop further. And in that case, countries also need a lot of support and encouragement. And as Gavin said, we need to give a benefit of doubt on this. And also we need to keep our eyes on helping Kazakhstan in that regard. And I want to express our sincere condolences to all who lost their lives in Kazakhstan. We've been there multiple times, and we also look forward to visiting again at some point. And we'll keep close eye on Kazakhstan. As Ambassador Ashkabayev said, that there should be huge engagement with the region, not only with Kazakhstan, but all Central Asia and the Caucasus as well. In fact, I'd like to say that I hope Kazakhstan will recover from this situation strong. And also would like to remind in the end that we have a very important event on February 1st coming up with the Caspian Policy Center. We'll be having the engagement that Ambassador Ashkabayev mentioned. We will have at least 2 speakers from the US government and also colleagues from the 8 countries of the region joining us for a, even if that is a virtual discussion, at least comment on the regional situation and the US relations with the Caspian and Greater Caspian region. Once again, we value Kazakhstan a lot, and I would like to thank all our participants and speakers for being part of this engagement. And we hope to see you in our event on February 1st. Thank you so much, and please stay connected with the Caspian Policy Center.